The Bible talks about the law being extremely important, over and over again, but Christianity teaches that the law no longer applies. Why is this? First, let us see what the Old Testament says about the law. Was it meant to be a temporary thing? No. The Bible says the law of God is eternal. See Psalms 111 verses 7 to 8, and Psalms 119 verse 160. Was keeping the law considered a good thing? Keeping the law is associated with being righteous and blameless. See Psalm 119 verse 1, Deuteronomy 6 verse 25 and Ezekiel 18 verse 9. Was the law difficult? No. The law is said to be doable. See Deuteronomy 30 verse 11. What were the benefits of keeping the law? Keeping the law resulted in blessings and prosperity. See Deuteronomy 28 verse 1, Deuteronomy 5 verse 33, Psalm 103 verses 17 and 18, Deuteronomy 30 verses 9 to 10 and 16. Did God want His people to keep the law? God required those He gave the law to keep the law. See Deuteronomy 10 verses 12 and 13, Joshua 1 verse 8, Joshua 22 verse 5 and Ezekiel 20 verses 19 to 20. Did not keeping the law have any consequences? Turning away from the law amounted to sin and resulted in curses. See Daniel 9 verse 5 and Deuteronomy 28 verse 15. So the Old Testament tells us that keeping the law was a good thing. What did Jesus have to say about keeping the law? Did He preach against keeping the law? Throughout His life, Jesus affirmed the law. Jesus did not teach people to follow the law for the sake of following the law, like the self-righteous Pharisees did. Rather, He emphasized on things like mercy and applied discretion with regard to the law. While He spoke against the man-made traditions of the Pharisees, Jesus clearly taught that the law was to remain. Was Jesus all right with those who broke the law? No. Jesus criticized those who broke and nullified the commandments of God. See Matthew 15 verses 2 to 6. Was Jesus against the Pharisees and scribes for being the custodians of the law? While Jesus harshly criticized the Pharisees and the scribes, He also instructed His followers to do as they said, for the reason that they sat in the seat of Moses. See Matthew 23 verses 2 to 3. Jesus did not oppose their positions as teachers of the law, but only questioned their hypocrisy. Did Jesus ever suggest He wanted to do away with the law or that He was exempt from it? Jesus said He hadn't come to destroy the law and the prophets, but rather to fulfill it. See Matthew 5 verse 17. Jesus was operating within the framework of the Israelite law. Jesus simply did not teach His followers to do away with the Old Testament law. Did Jesus even suggest that the law would end as soon as His work was completed? Jesus declared that the law would remain until heaven and earth pass away. See Matthew 5 verse 18. This indicates that the law should have been a part of Christian belief system today. What did Jesus say would happen to those who broke even the least of the commandments? Jesus said that those who ignore even the least commandment would be the least in the kingdom of heaven. See Matthew 5 verse 19. So we have seen that both the Old Testament and Jesus tell us that the law was important and was to be followed. But despite this, most Christians believe that the law has been done away with or that they are somehow exempt from keeping it. Where is this teaching coming from? One reason for this is that they distort the meanings of certain statements made by Jesus. His words on the cross, "It is finished," in John 19 verse 30, has been taken to mean Jesus fulfilled the law and that there is no more need of the law. This is an arbitrary assumption, as the passage is about the last moments of Jesus, and has nothing at all to do with whether or not the law is done away with. His act of saving the adulteress by telling the Pharisees, "Let he without sin cast the first stone," in John 8 verse 7, is taken to mean that the Old Testament law to execute adulterers is completely done away with. But the reality is that this passage is a forgery and is not present in the earliest manuscripts. His statement that what goes into someone's mouth does not defile them, as mentioned in Matthew 15 verse 11, has also been interpreted to mean that Jesus did away with the law. But this can easily be refuted by Acts 10. Peter receives a vision where he is told to eat all kinds of animals. Peter protests, saying he has never eaten anything unclean. This indicates that Jesus never taught that the Old Testament laws were abolished. Had he done so, then Peter would not have distinguished between clean and unclean animals and would have readily eaten whatever he is shown in his vision. As we see, Jesus never said anything that can be genuinely cited as proof texts for the law being done away with. However, there is another reason why Christians believe the law has been abolished. This reason is Paul, the self-proclaimed apostle. Paul happens to be the only figure in the Bible to speak explicitly against the law. In Galatians 2 verse 16, he claims a person is not justified by the works of the law, and thereby contradicts the Old Testament's teachings that keeping the law is associated with righteousness. In Galatians 3 verse 23, Paul asserts that believers were kept in custody under the law and were shut up to faith. But in reality, faith and the law worked hand in hand. Does Paul really think that those who followed the law in earlier generations lacked faith? In Galatians 3 verse 10, Paul goes so far as to call the works of the law a curse. Here Paul very clearly contradicts the words of Deuteronomy 11, where God connects obedience of the law with a blessings and disobedience with a curse. In Galatians 5 verse 18, Paul asserts that if one is led by the Spirit, he is no longer under the law. But the Old Testament says in Ezekiel 36, verse 27, that having the Spirit moves people to follow the law. Either Paul had no knowledge of this or was purposely teaching false doctrine. In Romans 6 verse 14, Paul claims believers are not under the law but under grace. In Romans 4 verse 15, Paul claims that if there is no law, there is no violation. That is about as stupid as saying if there is no man-made law, there is no crime. In Romans 7 verse 6, Paul declares believers have been released from the law. Paul, on his own authority, asserts that believers are released from the law and are not under the letter, meaning the laws of the Torah. That's odd, considering Jesus said in Matthew 5 verse 18, that every dot of the letter would remain until heaven and earth pass away. In Colossians 2 verse 14 he says the law was nailed to the cross, or perhaps that the sins that the law found them guilty of was nailed to the cross. Clearly Paul was teaching ideas that came from his own mind and not from God or Jesus or any of the prophets. While the Pharisees were on one extreme, inventing rules to protect the law, Paul was on the other extreme, inventing teachings to completely get rid of the law. There is not a single prophecy stating that the law would cease after the arrival of the Messiah. Jesus himself plainly stated that the law was to remain until heaven and earth passed away. Yet, Christianity's idea that the law was done away is based solely from the writings of one self-proclaimed apostle named Paul. Christians have given Paul's writings precedence over the clear teachings of the Old Testament and Jesus himself, and have, in the process, eliminated the need for the law. Perhaps Christians should remember Deuteronomy 4 verse 2, where God says man was not to take away or add to the law. It's hardly any wonder that Jesus foretells that he would say, "I never knew you," to the many Christians he calls lawless. Thank you for watching. Please like, subscribe and share.